Welcome to Living Liberation with psychologist Dr. Norissa Williams. Living Liberation invites you into discussion about how we embody liberation individually and collectively. We explore liberation in our relationships, school, and work contexts, and in society at large. We challenge and cultivate thinking that moves us all towards collective liberation. So we have Lisa Johnson here with us today. So we're looking forward to engaging and hearing more. So Lisa, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I am, I'm sorry. I am nervous, but I am by profession a school secretary with the New York City Department of Education. I've been with the city for about 24 years. I've been a secretary for at least the last 20 of those 24 years. In addition to that, I am a graduating senior in the Counseling for Mental Health and Wellness program at New York University. And so I
Yeah.
pride myself in saying that I am an advanced psychotherapist.
Nice, nice, nice. So in your years at the Department of Education, you've seen a lot, right? So I say this knowing that when we speak about power and privilege and we speak about who really runs things, who really sees it all, I know that that administrative staff, secretaries, you see it all. So I want to know from your perspective, what with respect to inequities and bias, what are some things you've noticed?
The New York City school system is the most segregated school system in the country. And you see that in all areas of the schools, the neighborhoods, resources. It's just prominent if you are in tune with it. And so my vantage point has allowed me to see inequities in terms of admissions, who gets into select schools, who doesn't, when heads are turned and looked the other way for certain parents as opposed to others. Favors are done, favors are curried. So money talks in some regards. Money also gives access to resources. There's inequities in suspensions, who gets suspension. So we all know about the school to prison pipeline. There are inequities in hiring. So 80% of the New York City teaching force is white women. Is it by design? Is it by coincidence? That's a question for debate. Or is it deliberate? And so I've seen biases and inequities in language, those for whom English may not be their first language. So there's disparities in services for people who English is a second language, the ESL population. There are biases and disparities, socioeconomic in terms of single mothers and the stereotypes that come along with single parent homes. It could look like, meetings being scheduled during work time, parent association meetings being scheduled during work time. It could look like IEP meetings being scheduled during work times. It could look like money being asked for trips when some people are making minimum wage and can't afford to pay bills, but you're asking for $100 for a camping trip. And I have multiple children in the school. It looks like those who are uneducated or perceived to be uneducated or undereducated, meaning they don't have college degrees. And so their perception is that you may not be as informed or as intelligent as the people who call themselves the professionals in the school. And so there's a condescending tone taking toward these parents and even toward staff who that might be the perception that you are undereducated or not as or uneducated as the staff. So therefore the comprehension level is assumed to be lower. It looks like lack of representation, which goes along with the hiring. The gamut and it looks like hierarchy, you know, the presumption and that crosses color spectrums of, you know, power and privilege and who has a right to certain access. So it's prevalent and the list is far too long.
Thank you, thank you. What are some ideas? I mean, you gave us so much to think about already though, right? So it's not easy to ask you what are some ideas when there's so much to fix, right?
But what if I could ask you three things, what are like three things that we can do? And feel free to answer more. I just don't want to put a whole lot of labor on you. What are three things that we can do to make the schools a more equitable place?
I think there has to be a greater accountability for hiring practices. You know, when you're allowed to maintain status quo, when you're allowed to perpetuate the wheels of white supremacy, racial inequity, that becomes the norm. And no one's holding you accountable. And no one's saying that your teaching staff doesn't represent your student population. So I definitely think there has to be some accountability when it comes to hiring. Who's being hired, who got denied, and why. And, there's a patriarchal system, there's a cronyism that comes along with that. So I hire my cousin's son or my teacher's best friend over an applicant who has already submitted an application. So I definitely think hiring is one. I would like to say bias training, but I don't always believe in it. So I think that they have to give the same kind of importance on being culturally responsive, culturally educated, that they do on the violence training and all the other things that come along with certification. It should be mandated. It shouldn't be optional in terms of what's required to become a teacher with the New York City school system, for one. And how do we hold those accountable who don't meet the benchmark, who constantly have infractions of racial bias or just plain racism against them? How do we hold them accountable? And what are we saying when we keep them and just sweep it under the rug? And I think the other thing in terms of teachers and is language. I think a lot of kids are looked at, a lot of people are looked at from it, are stereotyped, and they're looked at from a deficit perspective. And so I think that changing the language of how we speak to one another, how we speak to kids, how we look at one another could go a long way in the system.
Thank you. And so a lot of even what you said are structural changes, right? So, I mean, schools, many institutions outside of schools, they think the attempt is like, okay, give a training, give a professional development workshop. And in reality, we really need to change like the structures that be, you know what I mean? So hiring practices and, all of these things. So now when I speak of liberation, right, I'm speaking of how do we create context where people are free to be, where students, where faculty, social workers, staff are, they feel liberated. They can feel like they're themselves and they don't have to lean towards whiteness or, or any of those oppressive forces.
I think it's important. I think representation matters, you know, and being authentic and allowing the student to be authentic and to be a collaborator in the process is important to be liberated. I think the three fundamental things for any human being is to be seen, valued, and heard. And so why can't that extend to our students to be seen, valued, and heard in our curriculum, in our conversations, discipline, just across the board? How do you bring the student and the student's experiences into your classroom, into your community, and to make it a community? Because just because you say it's a community, my question then is, whose community is it? So how do you make it an inclusive community and not just give lip service to, Black Lives Matter or Black History Month or whatever cultural thing you're throwing on the board as an afterthought during the academic school year. So I think liberation equals representation and feeling included.
Thank you. I think a lot about vantage points, right? And so we each have different vantage points, different social locations, and you have a really unique one within the school system, right? So, what are some things, given your vantage point, have you been privy to that if people knew, you know what I mean, they'd be shocked. And and I'm thinking of things that really contribute to these inequities that we're talking about. And that might be how people talk about students, because you mentioned language and how people like what are some feel free to give us a story. Like what have you witnessed?
I had a teacher once who a student was going for a job interview in middle school, and his father came to pick him up, and he was so proud. Like this was his first job interview ever. And so he dressed up for his interview. And when the person came to tell him their father's there to pick him up, the teacher blurted out, "Oh, you going to meet your parole officer?" I had a teacher in a school who used to tell students when they were involved in disciplinary matters, I'm going to call ACS. These were students who, for whom English was not their first language, who might have had citizenship issues. So he would say, I'm going to call ACS. So you better bring your toothbrush to school tomorrow with you because they're going to take you out and you might get deported. I've had administrators say, we can't save that kid. And these are all kids of color. It's never, we can't save the white kid. It's always, we can't save the kid because, you know, they come from a broken home. All of our homes are broken. It's never the white student. And we know that that's false and that's a false narrative. If people knew that sometimes their kids are right when they're talking about adults, because everybody has their traumas. So what makes you think an adult didn't grow up as a victim of child molestation or alcoholism in their homes, substance abuse in their homes, and that they didn't bring that trauma to school? So sometimes I think people need to know your kids are right. So when they say, Miss So and so said something to me that was painful or hurtful, there's a chance that she really did say it. And I've heard those things. And I've heard then the teachers switch when they get on the phone with the parents. I've heard parents say, I didn't know you had any Black kids in this school. I've heard administrators do favors and transfer kids out of schools at high schools that students got in because the parents found out there was too many Black and brown kids in that school. I think I realized at a certain point that I had been racially traumatized myself, you know. And so you hear derogatory comments. You hear them making fun of the Black names or the Hispanic names or mocking the kids or neck rolling. But you can say Ludwig von Beethoven very easy, but you can't say Shaniqua. So I've heard those injustices against kids, and just the deficit language, welfare mom and absent father, or his father is your father in the home. I've heard a lot. I've heard a lot.
Thank you. So now this is a big question, and this is a big question that you might not have an answer for because I don't have an answer for. I'm thinking through it, right? So the people that take this course is voluntary, right? The people that take this course tend to be people who self-select and who are somewhere on the progressive scale, right? And so they work with people who are not as wanting to be anti-racist or believing in it or any of those things, right? Or believe in it with like this veil of liberalism, but the behavior is actually really very conservative or protecting of their privilege and all these kinds of things, right? How do we get those people involved, after we've taken this training and we're this class and we're like, we need more people on board. How do we do that? That's huge. And I don't expect you to have the answer because I don't have the answer, but I would like to just gauge what your thoughts might be.
I think that it depends on where you have the strength to have the conversations. Sometimes you might feel like that's more than I care to shoulder right now. And there might be the other days where you're like, no, I can't let that slide. So I would say on the days where you feel like, no, I can't let that slide, then don't let it slide. I think a lot of times we do things because we're uncomfortable, but I think that being uncomfortable is when you do it. I think a lot of times people are used to telling racial jokes, racist jokes, and we laugh at them out of discomfort. And so they keep telling them because now they feel like, oh, well, I've got an audience and it wasn't so bad. And so we let a lot of things go. And especially people who have proximity to whiteness or may be white, right? You hear these things, maybe at your dinner table, maybe at holidays, maybe in the classroom when there's no other Black or brown people around, and you just let it slide. So I think that if you've taken the training and you self-selected in and you hear it, speak on it if you have the energy. Otherwise, you can't call yourself my ally, my co-conspirator, or my accomplice. You're part of the problem, I think.
Very true, very true. And that's you've given us a nice little chunk there. It's a huge question, right? With so many answers to so many different parts. of how we do that. And is it on me to do that? Like, isn't it a system level thing? And shouldn't that be thought of way back, like you said, with like the hiring practices and different things like that? So thank you for giving us that, solid chunk of how we should be thinking about this and how we should also be protective of ourselves in this. So thank you so much for all that you've had to
you.
share.
Thank
Is
you.
there is there any last thought, anything I didn't ask that you would like to
No,
share?
I think it just goes down to like, we live in New York City, most of us, right? And since 9/11, we've been told if you see something, say something, because it's a safety issue. And I think the mental health and wellness of our children, of ourselves, are safety issues as well, right? So it's the same premise. If you see something, say something. And if you're silent, ask yourself why you're being silent when you know you just witnessed an injustice. And I think what happens is that the trauma of not saying something over time really kind of eats at you. So ask yourself, what is my silence going to cost me in the long run? So that would just be, something that I will offer for people to think about.
I like that. I like that. I like that. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for all that you've had to share.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you've loved what we've had to say, please press the subscribe button and don't forget to like. We invite you to also follow Dr. Norissa on Instagram at Dr. Norissa Williams and learn more about my professional services on liberationrpi.com.